I'm delighted to welcome an old friend and colleague to Mason. Professor Nadia Oweidat is an assistant professor at Kansas State University. She holds a PhD, or as they call it technically, a DPhil, from Oxford University, from is it the Oriental Studies?
Yes.
Faculty. Great. Her research and work focuses on the history, culture, and politics of the modern Middle East and North Africa, with a particular focus on intellectual history and, as we'll be hearing today, Islamic thought. In addition to her academic work, Professor Oweidat also has been engaged in public scholarship and has actually been involved in some of the practical dimensions of U.S. foreign policy and national security around these issues. She, during the 21 to 22 academic year, was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, one of the think tanks in Washington, D.C., and has also worked at the U.S. Department of State at the unit, I think now formally, unfortunately, known as the Global Engagement Center. I first had the opportunity to meet her as she was concluding her new-ish still, yes, 2024 book, The Case of Reform and Its Perils in Contemporary Islam, the case of Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, which came out last year with Oxford University Press. And this is the book that she's going to be speaking to today primarily, although she does also have some new research work in progress that kind of looks at what she frames as the virtual battlefield of ideas in the Arab world. So again, delighted that you're all here, and a true delight to welcome Professor Oweidat to George Mason.
Thank you.
Nadia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. I'm grateful to the Suleiman Center for inviting me. Grateful to Peter for this introduction, and for your time and attention for the time we're going to be spending together. So I think I'll put a little bit of background to why I even wrote a book about reforming Islam. So I grew up in Jordan, in a Muslim family, very traditional, very conservative, and there were a lot of limitations, as you can imagine, on what I could do, what I can say, what I can wear. And these limitations were attributed to Islam. So honestly, I had a very antagonistic relationship growing up because the limitations were because of Islam. So when I get to Oxford, I have already been an analyst at the Rand Corporation, so doing various research. And even then, I was really interested in reform. So way before there was a counter-narrative, I started reading in America. I actually discovered, almost by chance, a lot of novels written, and fiction and non-fiction books, written in the past century by people who had different ideas than what I was exposed to growing up in the Middle East. And I was shocked, truly. That was my reaction, and many people that I would introduce a lot of these books to. Wow, we have thinkers like this, so how come their ideas are not debated? How come, whether it's fiction or non-fiction? This is before the internet. I don't want to date myself, but you know, when I was a student, like I literally, as a student at Oxford, I interrupted my studies to like build a free online library, and went to the Middle East, spoke to publishers, and have still a stack this thick of from publishers, memorandums of understandings, basically telling me, if you give us $500 per book, and I mean liberal books, books that empower people, books that have a vision for the Middle East in which there's no oppression, in which people can self-actualize. So because these kind of books are banned, right, they told me, fundraise, you can put the books for free online, because they're not selling $500 worth of book. And I thought, for a great cause, definitely I'll be able to fundraise. Mind you, I was living off of student loans, but you know, luckily for me, because as a student also, especially a graduate student, you just want to do anything but your dissertation, right? So that was a great because as a distraction, what happened is while I was doing, the due diligence, somebody introduced me to somebody who is a philanthropist who actually can afford to do my vision, and was doing the same exact thing, because there was, I wasn't the only one who recognized that we need access to ideas that are non-violent, that believe in peaceful rotation of power, that believe in personal agency. And I basically said, okay, well, this person, is wealthy, they can afford to do it. And I actually met them, I thanked them for their effort, and they built a library called the Hindawi Foundation, hindawi.org, and they invited me to be on the board. So I still have my library without having to fundraise or do anything. But it has thousands of books for free, and the selection is basically books that espouse liberal democratic norms. And I like to take credit for even putting Abu Zayd's books in there for free, so people can actually debate his ideas. So back to reform ideas. So before it was even a thing, counter-narrative, I somehow convinced the Pentagon that to counter terrorism, because I was doing counter-terrorism work, you need to enable people from within the local, there are people from within who don't see violence as the way to change. And these people, there are so many challenges to disseminating their voices. So I led a study called the obstacles to the broad dissemination of creative works. I call them creative works. I looked at fiction, non-fiction, film. So people who are very creative, they use creativity, they use, it's a lot harder to lean on your creativity, on your on thinking, than it is to just, sheer violence, sheer intimidation. So I wanted for the Middle East, for my culture to really, engage with these kind of voices. So then I got into Oxford, and that nagging question, how much of the limitations that I faced, how much of it is really based on Islam, and how much of it is actually based on interpretations? I have really wrestled with that. So at Oxford, I was so incredibly lucky to have a phenomenal professor. I dedicate my book to mainly my professors. All but one is a professor. Actually, all of them are professors, but all but one taught me, actually. So professors, really inspire me, and I love that I have the profession I love, and following the footsteps of people who transform my life and career. So I took a class with Professor Ron Nettler. He's an intellectual historian, and that was the first time in my life that I really, really delved into liberal Islamic thought at a setting that you enjoy, of debate and exchange of ideas and critique, and it really unleashed something in me. So I actually started to read a lot of, again, I realized how many thinkers and intellectuals from the Muslim world, especially the Arabic-speaking world, have actually really delved into these ideas. They were not just in the minds of a few. There were, we here enjoy liberal democratic norms because somebody thought about things like citizenship and personal freedoms, and I don't know how many of you read one of my absolute favorite books, On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, or they were thinkers. What they did is think, right, about governance, and that we also in the Muslim Arabic-speaking cultures and worlds have had those. It's just that our heroes, our intellectuals, are not as well known to the people they write for. So as I was deciding, okay, so I definitely am a historian of ideas. Who do I write my dissertation on? Because I actually got into Oxford to write about something entirely different, and that is very common when you get into a PhD program with one idea. It's very rare that you actually end up with the same exact dissertation. because you know, and you should like, you know, you learn a lot of things that change you. Education changes us, right? This is why we have education. So as I was, you know, flirting with all these different intellectuals' ideas, I kept hearing, just don't do Abu Zayd. Just, he's really difficult. Just avoid him. Like, do Sadiq al-Adnan, for example, one reformer from Syria. Do, you know, Kawakibi. Also Syrian, by chance. So just don't do Abu Zayd. He's really convoluted, complicated. And I was really intrigued. I did not get this far in life by doing the, you know, obeying rules. I never was good at that. I obey some rules. But anyways, not one's on my mind. So basically, I studied, who is Abu Zayd? Who's this guy that everybody is like almost intimidated by? Why is he somebody that, you know, almost like too big a bite to swallow? So Abu Zayd is an Egyptian scholar. He comes from very modest family, which, you know, maybe I relate to him a little bit. His parents were not educated. Maybe they appreciated education. His father saw him as one day becoming like one of the Islamic scholars of all times, Muhammad Abdu, a scholar who also was, you know, wanting to reform Islam and modernize Islam. But he was very much from a modest background, and when he was a child, at 8 years old, he already was memorizing the Quran, and something unfortunate happened to him. When he was a teenager, and he's the oldest boy, his father died. So all his dreams of wanting to be educated sort of got dashed because he was the oldest male and he needed to work and support his family. So he quickly shifted his studies. You know, in the Middle East you have either the scientific track, if you would, the literary track, or industrial, where you do actual, you know, you learn practical things. I think it may be like that in Europe as well. So he became actually a technician, but he never gave up on his dream of becoming a scholar. It's like, I feel like, again, maybe he inspires me because like I could relate to him in many ways. He still had that love of ideas, he was somebody who watched how what Islam is changed depending on who's in power. When it was trendy to, you know, to be with the Muslim Brotherhood, he was inspired by, he was a child, mind you, but he was inspired, that is Islam. When Islam became ishtiraki, socialist, then Islam was socialist because socialism was trendy. When Sadat came to power in Egypt and Islam became neoliberal, if you would, then that became Islam. So I was like, which one is real Islam? Like, everybody who comes to power changes what that means. So he was a natural, and I think all of us are natural critical thinker, right? So as he was working full time, he continued to take classes and basically graduated top of his class studying Arabic at the University of Cairo. And because he was an excellent student, they sort of promoted him to be a graduate student. And at Cairo University, where he studied, there was a chair at the university, right? And that chair was held by very, very important names in the history of Egypt. Maybe some of you have heard of Taha Hussein. He is, you know, the father of Arab culture, is referred to one of his titles. And other maybe less known, Amin al-Khuli, less known intellectuals. But basically that chair has been vacant for a long time. Why? Because it was held before by people who wanted, again, to push the debate and further than the parameters in which it has existed for decades, if not centuries. So Taha Hussein, for example, you know, poetry is something that is really important in Arabic-speaking cultures. So he examined the so-called pre-Islamic poetry, and he realized this poetry is actually not pre-Islamic. This poetry is very much, you know, it documents things that came after the spread of Islam. And that's a very controversial issue because this poetry celebrates wine and dancing and things that supposedly once Islam came, everybody became pious Muslim. One version doing only what's appropriate, which is even logically is not really the case. People have never been so, one copy. So anyways, so for pushing the debate, like let's examine these. But sadly, there is no room for debate. Like ideas, I always tell my students, everywhere I teach them, in the Muslim world, in the Western world, I haven't yet had, I'm sure it will be amazing one day to teach in the Muslim world, but that we cannot take for granted the ability to debate ideas. In fact, we have a responsibility to take advantage of the freedom we have, because whatever we produce is for the whole world anymore. So we are the voice of many who cannot critique, cannot question. So back to Taha Hussein, he was fired from his position. He was he went through a trial of apostasy because he dared just to pause that this poetry is not, and we're not even talking Quran or something sacred. We're talking poetry. But it gives you an idea of the atmosphere that it really, maybe what's analogous is maybe medieval Europe or something. Like you cannot, there are too many taboos. Everywhere you look, there's too many taboos. So when his department said to him, we want you to do your graduate studies to fill this chair, he was a little bit hesitant because like everybody before me had an apostasy trial, and it's very funny, he would too. So, but eventually he succumbed to the pressure and studied basically Quranic studies. So Abu Zayd is one of, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people, one of the most important reformers of the modern Arabic intellectual history and thought. Why? Because he pushed the debate further than so many before him. He went to the heart of the taboo. He didn't dance around it, he went to the heart of the taboo. So this intellectual, as I look at him now that I've finished the book, as we all do, he grew even in his ideas, he grew in his, the way he looked at things. So in the early stages of him being a scholar, he was almost like a technician, he was, okay, let's look at the Quran, like when the verse says, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق, read in the name of your God who created. So who's speaking? Because it's not Allah, there's a speaker, but the speaker is speaking about God that is absent here. He's speaking about God. So there's a lot of technicalities that essentially the Quran is a language. There's a speaker, there's a receiver, it's a tanzeel. Tanzeel is like, it's a coming down or something. It's a wahi, it's a revelation. It's not something, now in modern times, we know even physics is not even so determined. We have quantum physics that bends time and space, let alone language. And language, what Abu Zayd and practically all the people that held that chair in his department, what they recognize is that there is a lot of room in this language to have an interpretation that basically allows for norms, for a way of governance that is very conducive to self-actualization, if you would. So he published, Mafhum al-Nas, he published a lot of books looking at these nuts and bolts of the language of the Quran, right? And then, he really is such a dedicated scholar. So he won a scholarship to go he actually first came to America, University of Pennsylvania, I believe. And at the University of Pennsylvania, he was introduced to, sciences like, even, oh my goodness. So there's when you look at language, there's semantics, and there are a whole bunch of sciences that deal with interpreting text and understanding text in certain context, right? It is not an art divorced from, again, the environment who receives it. The roots in Arabic is so rich in its roots. So he got to see how the Christians reformed, how the Jewish people reformed, how they dealt with the text, so it was such an introduction to him. Then he got another scholarship to Japan. So Japan is a traditional culture, but one that doesn't revere a text. And that was very interesting to him, that, wow, like traditions can be even divorced from a text. Here is a very traditional culture that doesn't live by a certain text. So it really, his scholarship kept growing and growing as he was exposed to different perspectives. So he really, in many ways, preaches what he practices what he preaches, in being open and always looking for ways to expand and looking for ways to enrich the understanding of the sciences. So then, as he was in Japan, he heard about a big scam in Egypt. And that scam was, these societies are naturally, like, they're very traditional. They're not as, every society has its own uniqueness. And somebody came up with a financial scheme where they basically promise people halal investment. Like, it's halal, it's blessed, but it's still trade according to modern times. But using the word halal tickled the sentiments of a lot of people. So many people invested their entire savings because they thought, because it's halal, it's gonna be massive earnings. So you play on the greed, but you also play on the spirituality. Like, it's a win-win, right? What happened is, and of course there were a few religious, scholars like saying, yes, this is halal investment, get your money out of any non-halal and put it here, this is better. And maybe, like a lot of schemes we've heard about, it turned out to be an entirely, it's not a sound investment. And just because you can slam halal on something does not make it, it's people. It's people who assign that. So Abu Zayd really understood that the discourse really matters. The spiritual discourse has an impact on people. But it's a discourse made by human beings, by people. It is not made by God himself. So he wrote a book called Naqd al-Khitab al-Dini, Critique of Religious Discourse, in which he wanted to differentiate between, the sacred text and the discourse about the text, because they're two different things. So it's very common in Islamic history, and I'm very aware, and so was Abu Zayd, that the Muslim world is much bigger than the Arabic-speaking world. And I say Arabic-speaking because it's not just Arabs, but it's Arabic-speaking. And Arabic speakers constitute maybe 20% of all Muslims. So, but a lot of times people, merge the two, but it's a very, very diverse populations. And sometimes they have nothing in common, no language except their religion, no geography, so it's very, very diverse. So for Abu Zayd, he focused on the Arabic speaking, although later he would widen that to include the Muslim world. So back to this book. So he wanted to distinguish between the sacred and the discourse. The sacred is sacred, okay, the Quran is from God. But Shafi'i, one of the collectors of hadith, one of the most important scholars of Islam, he's not God. His interpretation is not as sacred as the Quran. It's his interpretation as a human being, fallible human being. So why should we revere him why can't I challenge him as a fellow Muslim? So he wanted to distinguish between the discourse and the sacred. And in doing so, he noted how in the modern context, he was very, very outspoken about critiquing people who use religion for political or other very much worldly gains, right? So he wanted to draw people's attention that a lot of times these people who speak in Islam's name, they conflate themselves with Allah as if they are Allah when they speak. But actually, it's just their own interpretation. It's not, what the sacred says. The sacred, he likes to quote very, 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 very early hadiths like the Quran is Hammal Awjuh. It has many faces, right? It's open to interpretation. Even during the time when Muhammad was alive, people will come to him and say, what about this? They debated him, they asked him, and it was in their time, coming from the source, the messenger himself, and people yet had questions, let alone 1500 years later. So he wanted to separate, he wanted people to be alert, to not fall for those who speak as if they are God's representatives. He wanted to alert people to note the hyperbole, if you would, in the discourse. He wanted to also, he even dared say that the sciences of religion, of spirituality, should have their own space, and that should be differentiated from, scientific pursuits. And why should these scholars who know nothing about medicine decide medical issues, or even issues of art? What do they know about art? So basically stick to your own field. Like, just because you studied, Sharia, let's say, does not make you a scholar in everything there is in the world. So he basically wanted to emphasize the human element in the interpretation of Islam. But he wanted to do something else. So Abu Zayd, par excellence, was such a global citizen, truly, truly a global citizen. He believed in humanity. He was such a humanist by nature. He did not believe in us versus them. He did not. So he believed in liberal democratic values in the best way, right? Like everybody should be free to believe what they want. He did not believe that somebody is free until they become Muslim, then they lose that freedom. Then you no longer can say, oh, I changed my mind. Nope, you're only free to one-way street. And he also believed the community shouldn't pressure. This is very Stuart Mill idea. The community should not pressure individuals to believe. So he has these very modern, liberal, democratic ideas. But he was a believer. He was a true believer. He wasn't just, and he truly believed the divine could not possibly mean that, people have no freedom of faith. There's no way. The divine could only be good. The divine could only be for women being treated as equal human beings in every way. The divine, so there was a lot of belief that my own critique, not necessarily based on reality and history or text, but something does not have to be factual to be powerful, right? Like, again, emotions. And so, for example, he was like a really passionate advocate for women's rights, minority rights. But for example, I couldn't tell how he could, like he almost evaded. How could you justify, for example, sexual slavery of children? This is something that existed for 1500 years in Islamic heritage text. You can round up these girls and they become sabaya. That is a fact. This is not like, oh no. That's a war crime in today's norms, right? So how can you say no, really, you just need to interpret it differently? this is, but again, like there is a fact. For me, I wasn't convinced, honestly. I was not convinced. You just need to interpret it enough so that this was never allowed in the Quran. The Quran is very clear about a lot of things that I think, again, in my opinion, this is my scholarly contribution, is that this is the limits of reform. While knowing that for many Muslims, especially believers, and I'm from a family of such, no, there is no way that there's such a thing. Because, we are product of modern history. We're product of modernity. We're product of people project into their faith their own values in every era. So when Abu Zayd, so this book was published, but it was too scholarly, and most people, it was banned. Most people didn't have access to it. So most people couldn't even follow these very, very intellectual debates that are so minute and so, honestly, half the language you have to be quite a scholar to follow them, right? So it was banned, nobody read it, and then he went out for promotion. And one of the people in his promotion was somebody who was one of these scholars. Remember that financial scam? He was one of these scholars who, he was a preacher at a mosque, and of course he took it personally. How dare you, because he was one of the people. He said you shouldn't use people's faith and spirituality to make money off of them. So he went to the mosque, Amr al-As mosque. Amr, al-As is the conqueror of Egypt. And he told a congregation, this guy is an infidel, this guy is an apostate, not an infidel, sorry. And, he should be excommunicated. And sadly, when you don't have open debates and rule of law, and it's a very authoritarian system, a lot of people who don't even, they just basically take that authority's word for it. There is no due diligence, there's no, most people who protested the cartoons have never even seen the cartoons. So anyways, basically some of the people who were in the congregation sued basically to declare Abu Zayd an apostate. Long story short, the court sided with them, and if you're an apostate, you cannot be married to a Muslim woman. So they legally divorced him from his wife, even though they're both professors. She's a professor of French. And if you're an apostate, it's the duty, in popular culture, for Muslims to kill you because you left Islam. And so, fearing for his life, Abu Zayd escaped to the Netherlands with his wife, where he had, the Netherlands truly did a great service to humanity, in my opinion, because at Leiden University, he would continue his scholarship, but now he has a new passion. He recognizes, wow, this is bigger than me. This issue of reforming Islam is one that we're grappling with at a global, at the global stage, especially that 9/11 happened, and then there was this Islamophobia also on top of it, and he was somebody who can actually take on these complex issues. But he was deemed an apostate, and that actually, when I talk about Islam and its reform and its perils, number one peril to reform, and not just Islam, I dare say, in authoritarian regimes in general, and I'm talking here mainly about the Arab world, is that there's not a lot of room for reform. And those who dare to push the envelope and ask questions, even at just the level of ideas, if your ideas are sound, if you look at them again, if I look at them and ask questions, they still should be sound. I tell my students, imagine if we revered Newton's laws and said, we cannot touch Newton, man. If his ideas are correct, even if we examine them, they'll still be correct, right? But we have gone so far because we examined, we critique, we double check, and if it's right, it'll still be right, right? And progress doesn't happen if we're not allowed to ask ideas and critique. So Abu Zayd really took on with passion this call for reform. And again, his ideas, some of them are really, in my, again, scholarly judgment, are incredibly sound, and there needs to be so much more scholarship, because we honestly don't even know most of our history. Like, if you look at the Middle East, in today's we look at a lot of conflict and authoritarianism. That region has had thousands of years of history. Abu Zayd looked at the Middle East as a bark of a tree, and Islam is just the latest, shell. But there was, and he always says also, like, if you look at Quranic studies, you cannot understand the Quran if you don't know what's predated the Quran, because it's answering questions about things that predated. Islam was a new thing, engaged with a lot of older ideas. And he wanted people of the Middle East to celebrate the cultures and civilizations that predated Islam. He believed, and there's, a verse that can totally be seen as that God sent many messengers, and many, who's to say that these civilizations were not part of, Dhul Qarnayn is mentioned in the Quran, and he may be Alexander the Great. Like, who knows? We are so limited compared to the mind of God. And the word of God is so expansive that to limit it in the words of even the Quran is almost insult to the divine. But Abu Zayd also understood that there is a culture, there is a heritage, there's a psychology of revering what's old at the expense of what is new, because what's new it's not ours. We can't claim it as ours versus what's already there. I'm going to keep it shorter so I can answer your questions. But basically, to sum it up, Abu Zayd produced many books. He was a very prolific author, looking at this question of reform. He believed the only correct interpretations, because he believed in multiplicity of views, are ones that respect the humanity of and the modern liberal democratic rights of every person, no matter who they are, Muslim, non-Muslim, man, woman. That is the only correct divine message. And I'll leave it at that.